Hello and welcome to the Nazi Germany revision video for part 3. We're going to be looking at opposition economic policies both before and during the war and also the impact of World War II. You should already have this revision booklet, and as we're going through it today, I'd like you to highlight and annotate with some extra details, and if you don't have the booklet, you can just make your own revision materials as we go through. We're going to start off looking at opposition to the Nazis, and you're going to need page 9 of your revision booklet. Now, before we begin thinking about who didn't like the Nazis and why, you need to understand that actually the vast majority of Germans did support the Nazis. A lot of them had benefited from their social policies, and a lot of people saw Hitler as a great and powerful leader, and there was the Hitler myth that surrounded Hitler, that he was doing good for Germany. For the people that didn't like the Nazis, it was sometimes because they didn't like a certain policy, and sometimes it was more broader opposition to them. Some people went as far as trying to do things like assassinating Hitler, and there were actually 50 attempts on his life whilst he was in power. However, for the majority of people that resisted the Nazis, it was much more about passive resistance, grumbling or moaning about their policies, making an anti-Nazi joke, or doing things like refusing to do the Nazi salute. So generally, there wasn't lots of extreme opposition to the Nazis, but there was some criticism of them whilst they were in power. We're going to go through and look at 4 different groups and what they did to oppose the Nazis, and we're going to begin with political opposition. Please bear in mind that the stuff that's written in blue on the next few slides is stuff that isn't in your revision pack, and you may want to add some of these points into the margins. So first of all, thinking about political opposition, well, why did they oppose them? I'm thinking here about the Communists and the SPD. Both of these left-wing parties wanted more equality in German society, and they hated the idea of a dictatorship, and they hated the right-wing Nazi party. They also despised the fact that the Nazis had turned Germany into a dictatorship by August 1934, when Hitler had become the Führer. There were no longer any free elections because all political parties other than the Nazis were banned in July 1933. Hitler had also done things like arresting many members of left-wing parties, and by the end of 1933, the year he became Chancellor, 2/3 of the KPD, the Communists, had actually been arrested and put in the newly created concentration camps, places like Dachau. The SPD were also arrested, although lots of their leaders managed to actually flee Germany and live in exile. They continued to try and oppose the Nazis from foreign countries. Obviously, that wasn't that effective because they weren't even there. Generally, political opposition wasn't very effective because the Gestapo, the secret state police, had made things difficult as people were very scared of them. Therefore, they couldn't organise any effective mass opposition because they had to rely on word of mouth and they had to really trust the people they were talking to. So opposition was quite small scale, and instead the SPD and the KPD tried to focus on how they were going to run Germany after the Nazis fell from power, rather than thinking about how they were actually going to overthrow them, because that seems like quite an impossible task at that point. Pause the video here if you want to make any notes. The next area that you need to know about is opposition from the churches. Remember, this needs to be broken down into the 2 areas of the Catholics and the Protestants. First of all, in terms of the Catholics, they actually compromised with the Nazis in 1933. As part of Hitler trying to gain control over different sections of society and make himself dictator, he signed the Concordat with the Catholic Church in July. This was an agreement between the Church and the Nazis, where Hitler agreed that he would leave Catholic schools and youth organisations alone, and in return, the Catholics would not oppose the regime and would voluntarily disband their Centre Party, which was the Catholic political party. However, the Nazis couldn't be trusted to keep their agreement, and by 1935 they'd started attacking Catholic schools and closing them down. This then led to the Pope being very angry and writing a letter in 1937 called With Burning Concern. It wasn't very effective in terms of opposition though, because the Nazis just responded by arresting lots more Catholic priests. One good example though of the Catholic opposition to the Nazis came in 1941 when a minister called von Galen publicly opposed the policy of euthanasia, where they were murdering innocent disabled people. As a result of the fact that this was in 1941 during the Second World War and when the Nazis needed the support of the population, the Nazis actually temporarily stopped this programme in response because they were worried about opposition, and then they carried it on afterwards in secret. So generally, the Catholics didn't really widely oppose the Nazis. They only opposed them when it came to their independence and their own autonomy. Think about the Protestants then. Well, the Protestants generally felt that Nazism was morally wrong. Not all of the Protestants felt this way. In fact, actually, a lot of them had voted for the Nazis, but the ones that did oppose them didn't like it. People like Bonhoeffer and Niemöller were two examples of Protestants that didn't like the Nazis. Now, the Nazis created something called the Reich Church, the Nazi Church, which even had things like swastikas in it. And they didn't like this mixing of church and state, and therefore they created something called the Confessional Church, which had the support of 5,000 of the Protestant leaders out of the 17,000 there were in Germany. The Nazis tried to crush this and arrested both of these leaders, with one of them dying in a concentration camp and the other one surviving but going through a horrendous experience. So generally, overall, in terms of the church, there wasn't that much opposition. You could argue that actually the Protestants came up with greater opposition. If we're thinking about the most effective form of opposition, it was definitely von Galen. The church certainly could have been much more powerful if they'd more widely opposed the Nazis or if they'd worked together. Pause the video here if you need to make some notes about the church. The next group you need to know about is young people and how they oppose the Nazis, and there are three key groups that you need to know about. The first one is the swing youth. Now, these were not seen as being really powerful opposition by the Nazis because they were people that just didn't like to conform, and they used to do things like listening to band, jazz and swing music. We might not see them as serious opposition, but the Nazis still counted them as opposition and tried to ensure that they actually listened to the appropriate music according to them and that they would attend Hitler Youth meetings. From 1936, they tried to do it by banning all other youth groups, and by 1939, they had made membership to the Hitler Youth compulsory. The next group is the Edelweiss Pirates, who again before the Second World War weren't seen as being a major threat to the Nazis, because they were just people that used to do things like staying out late, drinking, listening to band jazz music and making fun of the Hitler Youth, as well as occasionally beating up its members. However, during the Second World War, this particular group became more extreme, and actually they were doing things like helping escaped prisoners of war, army deserters, and they even killed a Gestapo chief in Cologne. That then resulted in the Nazis executing some of their leaders in 1944. So the Edelweiss Pirates became more extreme over time. The next group that you need to know about is the White Rose Group. This is a group that was only formed during the Second World War and was formed by Hans and Sophie Scholl as well as a man called Christoph Probst. They protested against Nazi policies, especially those about women and Jews. They didn't like the fact that the Nazis were trying to enforce these gender roles, and they felt that Nazi policies were going to ruin Germany. They felt they were inhumane in their policies towards the Jews. So what they did is they published 3 anti-Nazi posters and leaflets and left these all over the campus of Munich University. They were caught soon after and then executed by being beheaded in February 1943, even though they were very young at the time. So generally, in terms of youth opposition, you need to understand that there was quite extensive youth opposition, but still about 95% of the youth supported the Nazis. The Nazis had to deal with more opposition over time, especially after 1939, when they had tried to make membership to the Hitler Youth compulsory. Pause the video here if you want to make some notes about it. The last group we're going to be thinking about is the army and how they opposed the Nazis. Now, generally, lots of members of the army were actually quite supportive of the Nazis. They had liked some of their policies, like rearmament, their foreign policy, and how they'd made Germany strong again. However, in 1938, there was a small group led by a man called General Beck, who was very worried that Hitler's foreign policy was going to cause the Second World War, and they had planned to remove him if they had the support of the British. The British didn't support them, and so nothing ever happened. Now, if we're thinking about during the war, when the war turns against Germany in 1943, after they lose something called the Battle of Stalingrad, lots of members of the army are starting to feel very worried that they're going to lose the war. And so there's a group led by somebody called Klaus von Stauffenberg that you can see in this picture here. And they organise a bomb plot to try and assassinate Hitler. They plant a bomb at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, and it detonates during a meeting, destroying the room. And the only reason that it failed to kill Hitler is because somebody moved the briefcase and it ended up being put just behind a very strong table leg. Now, as a result of this, over 5,000 people were arrested and executed, and the plot failed because they didn't kill Hitler, and also they'd failed to seize control of the radio. They planned to announce that Hitler was dead and they were taking over, but obviously things didn't go to plan. After this, the army had no chance to oppose the Nazis because Hitler took full control of the army. So that's what you need to know about for army opposition. Pause the video here if you want to make some notes. Next area that you need to know about is economic policies over time. Now, there are 3 different sections that you'll need to know about. The first one is about what Hitler's economic policies were like between 1933 and 1936 when he first came to power. Then you'll also need to know about the 4-year plan and how he prepared for war. And finally, you'll need to know about World War II and how the German economy was doing during that. So we're going to go back to page 5 of your revision booklet now, and we're going to talk about what Hitler was doing between 1933 and 1936. We did briefly talk about this in the part 2 video, but we're going to go back over it in a bit more detail now. Now, when Hitler first came to power, when he became Chancellor on the 30th of January 1933, Germany was going through the Great Depression, and it was really badly affected, more so than many other industrialised nations, because of things like the Dawes Plan. There had been 6 million people that were unemployed as a result of the 50,000 businesses that had collapsed. And Hitler's priority was to provide the work and bread that he'd promised in the election. And he did this in a few different ways. Some of it was about actually getting people jobs, and some of it was about cheating the statistics to make them look better. The first way that he tried to reduce unemployment was through the RAD, or the National Labour Service Programme. This was a programme for young men between the ages of 18 and 25, and they had to do 6 months of compulsory training building things like hospitals, autobahns and schools. Whilst they were doing this, they were gaining skills that would help them find employment later on. It helped the German economy to recover because they were building new workplaces like these hospitals and schools. But it also meant that they didn't count as unemployed whilst they were doing it, and so it reduced the numbers of unemployed in Germany. The Nazis also benefited from this because whilst they were doing it, they also did military training and trained to become future soldiers. The Nazis didn't even pay them properly, they just gave them pocket money. So that was really good for the Nazis to try and reduce the number of people that were technically unemployed. And it was a way of them kind of cheating the system a bit as well. Second of all, Nazis tried to rearm Germany. If you remember Hitler's foreign policy, he'd wanted to gain Lebensraum, or living space, in the east. He'd wanted to abolish the Treaty of Versailles and get rid of communism. Now, to do all of that, he needed to rearm. When he first came to power, the German army only had 100,000 men in it as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler began rearming in secret in 1933. By 1935, he was doing it openly, and he introduced conscription as well as doing things like holding that military rally. And by 1939, 1.4 million men were in the army. And that means that he's managed to gain an extra 1.3 million jobs. But not only that, those people in the army also need resources. They need uniforms, they need equipment, and therefore there has to be more factories made to try and make all that equipment for them. So this was a really clever way of Hitler reducing unemployment by spending on things like rearmament. Lastly, Hitler did manage to win the battle for work, as he claimed, by cheating the system. He said he got rid of unemployment, but he also manipulated the statistics. For instance, people that were workers that only worked seasonally, say working on an ice cream cart, were now counted as full-time. People that had been sacked, for instance, women and Jews, and their jobs had been taken by men, and those people weren't then counted in the unemployment statistics. And so a historian called Evans has talked about the fact there were actually 1.5 million people that were invisibly unemployed that just didn't count on the statistics, even though they didn't have a job. So generally, his first policy was to try and reduce unemployment, and actually he'd been largely successful with that, even though he cheated a bit. So you might want to pause the video here and add a little bit about economic policies between 1933 and 1936 and whether he actually achieved his short-term aim. Next area that you need to know about is his policies between 1936 and 1940. So we're going to think about something called the 4-year plan. Now, if you remember, Germany had actually lost the First World War because of the British naval blockade, where they had basically starved Germany into submission after 400,000 Germans had died of starvation or illnesses linked to it. So Hitler wants to try and make sure that that doesn't happen again. He wants to make sure that Germany is completely self-sufficient and they don't rely on any resources, raw materials, food, anything from other nations. And he starts dealing with this in 1936. The reason that he doesn't start with it straight away is because he felt unemployment was a bigger issue to tackle. But now that he claims he's solved that by 1936, he can focus on this next aspect of his economic policy. So he puts a man called Goering in charge of the 4-year plan that begins in 1936, trying to make Germany ready for war in 4 years. Now, they did increase the production of some key commodities for war, for instance, iron and steel, and they did have some real successes. They were trying to find things like artificial substitutes for different goods, and they had had some success with that. They tried to do things as well, like making coffee out of acorns, which was less successful. But generally, they had done well to produce more within Germany itself. However, it wasn't perfect. And actually, by 1939, when the war breaks out, they're actually still importing a third of their raw materials. So in terms of the 4-year plan itself, they don't achieve all of their ambitious targets, but they still make great strides into becoming more self-sufficient. This has a real impact, though, on the people of Germany and their living standards. And Goering very famously talked about the guns versus butter debate, saying that the German people could only have one. The guns obviously to symbolise the military and what they need for war, and the butter to symbolise consumer goods. So as a result of the fact that their industry was very much focused on rearmament, this resulted sometimes in things like food shortages, rising food prices, and also lower living standards because consumer goods weren't produced as cheaply because their factories were focusing on producing goods that were needed for war. So in terms of the 4-year plan, it was successful in increasing the amount that Germany produced, but it didn't meet its ambitious aims. Another area to be aware of for Hitler's economic policy before the war is something called the MEFO bill scheme. This was a kind of result of the financial genius of a man called Schacht. And what he did basically was paid for loads of rearmament, about 12 billion Reichsmarks with basically an effective form of a government IOU. So don't worry about the details of the MEFO bill scheme. You don't really need to know those. Focus mainly on making sure that you've got the key things down about the 4-year plan and about what Germany had achieved. Pause the video here if you need to do that. The final area that we need to know about is how well prepared the German economy was in 1939 when war broke out and how this changed during World War II. So we've seen already that Goering had tried to create the 4-year plan from 1936 and make Germany self-sufficient. We know that they'd managed to increase things like their agricultural output, they managed to make a lot more weapons, and that they had built up their industry. However, when the war broke out, the German economy wasn't ready for such a prolonged war. Hitler hadn't been expecting the war to break out over Poland in 1939 because he expected that the British and French would continue with their policy of appeasement. He thought he'd have another couple of years to get the German economy ready. Now, during these first few years of war, Despite the fact that actually their economy was unprepared, they actually managed to mask the issues with their economy because of their series of quick military victories. By the end of 1941, the Nazis had taken over loads of different countries, including places like Holland, Belgium, France, Norway, parts of Russia, loads of different areas, as well as the area that they gained before the war even started, for instance, Czechoslovakia and Austria. So at first, they'd managed to hide the fact that their economy wasn't doing too well. Now, they also improved their economy, not only by stealing the resources of other places, but also when a man called Albert Speer became the Minister for Armaments and Production in 1942. He was a real genius when it came to economic measures, and he completely reorganised and transformed the German economy and did things like drastically increasing arms production. When he first became the Minister for Armaments, Germany was spending 11 times what Britain was to produce half as many tanks. But within a few months of him becoming the Minister of Armaments, tank production increased by 250%. He also tried to kind of pursue unpopular policies, for instance, getting women to work in the factories. Nazis had been ideologically opposed to that and wanted women in the homes. However, after a few years of war and after rising casualties on the Eastern Front when they were fighting against the Soviet Union, the Nazis eventually, from late 1943, had to accept that women needed to work in the factories, and they did ask all women between the ages of 17 and 45 to register for war work. Albert Speer also used slave labourers. At least 7 million people were working in these factories in brutal conditions, both inside and outside Germany. He was incredibly successful in the role, and actually industrial production in Germany peaked in August 1944, despite the fact that they were being bombed day and night by the British and the Americans. So he really drastically improved the German economy, and it's claimed by some historians that he actually extended the war by 2 years. So the key things that we need to understand about the German economy in World War II. First of all, remember that the German economy wasn't ready because they hadn't expected war to break out then. They were unprepared at first, but the inefficiencies of the German economy had been masked by their successes. However, from 1942, under the direction of Albert Speer, things really improved for Germany in terms of their economy, and they were making use of different groups, for instance, women and slave labourers. So that's what you really need to know about the German economy in World War II. Pause the video to highlight your notes, and you might also want to add the bits in blue because they're not actually in your revision pack. The final area you need to know about is the impact of World War II on Germany. Now, we've already mentioned this briefly when we've thought about the war and about the German economy in World War II. We've also thought about opposition and actually the fact that opposition increased in World War II as well. But we're going to talk through some key points that you need to know generally about how World War II affected the home front. Now, first of all, it's important to bear in mind that the war is going on between September 1939 and May 1945, and there were lots of different phases of this. First of all, in the first couple of years of war, between September 1939 and June 1941, the Nazis were doing incredibly well and were very successful. If we have a little look at this map here, you can see that Germany was the bit in red in 1933. Before the war even breaks out, we know they take over Czechoslovakia and Austria. By the end of 1939, they've invaded Poland and it started the Second World War. By the end of 1940, you can see they've taken over places like France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway. And then by the end of 1941, they've taken over places like Yugoslavia and Latvia and Estonia as well. So in terms of those first couple of years, the blitzkrieg or lightning tactics were incredibly successful, and the Nazis were able to use all the resources of those countries to keep their economy going. At first as well, the German people weren't really having to suffer too much. There was some rationing of some goods and there were some shortages of things like clothes and washing powder. actually generally the people of Germany were able to have enough to eat. There was some sacrifices that they needed to make though. For instance, wages were less than before and you couldn't ask for a pay rise because that would be unpatriotic, and their working hours increased as well to an average of 50 hours within the first year of the war. We've seen that between 1939 and 1941, the German people weren't too badly affected by the war as things were going well. However, the war started to turn against Germany by February 1943 after their defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad. Now, after this, the Germans realised the desperate nature of their situation and they began a policy of total war. Goebbels gave a speech in February 1943 where he asked the German people to give everything they could to making sure that they won the war. As a result, the German people had to put up with worse standards of living, and things like rations were decreased, non-essential production was stopped, so there was less luxury items, and more women were expected to work. We've already mentioned that actually women between the ages of 17 and 45 had to register for war work, and they could only get out of it, for instance, if they were pregnant. By 1944, as a result of this, 50% of the workforce were women. Eventually, as the Nazis got more and more desperate, they had to ask younger and younger boys to join the Home Guard, basically to be the military fighting force if people ended up in Germany. And by the end of the Second World War, they were enlisting people as young as 13 to help defend Germany. So from 1943, life gets worse and it's quite tough for the German people. We're also having to deal with the bombings, which have been going on quite intensively since 1942. And 61 cities are bombed by the Allies day and night. As a result of this policies of bombings, 400,000 German civilians are killed, which is very extreme, especially when you compare it to the Blitz in England, where about 43,000 people were killed. There was also lots of people that were made homeless. 3.6 million homes were destroyed, about 20% of the homes in Germany. Now, these bombings were seen as being incredibly unfair by the Germans, especially when you think about what they did in Dresden and how they bombed civilian areas in February 1945, even though Germany had essentially lost the war by that point. The impact on Germany was also enormous. They ended up having to deal with a major refugee crisis of all these people that were homeless and without access to any kind of fuel or water or food. So the war was devastating for the German civilians, but only really got bad for them from about late 1942, early 1943. If you want to know any more about the impact of World War II and you get a bit of time at the end of this lesson, you could always go on and watch the Year 10 lesson, which you can find on Miss Monroe's YouTube channel. Pause the video here if you need to make any notes about the impact of World War II. Well done, you've now listened to all the key content for parts 1, 2 and 3 of Nazi Germany. Remember, if there are any areas that you're still unsure of, please go back and re-watch parts of the video or the whole video to make sure that you're really comfortable with the different topics. Now, before we go back to your teacher on Teams, I just want you to start with making sure that you understand all the answers to these different questions that we've got on the slide. So there are 13 different questions, and these come from the short answer test on Nazi Germany Part 3. So make sure you can answer them and pause the video here to do so, and then you can check your answers on the next slide. Here we've got the answers to those part 3 questions. What I'd like you to do is just pause the video and have a read through them. Just think about your own answers that you were thinking of and whether any of these answers here are different. If there's any questions that you struggled with, again, it would be a great idea to either go back to your class notes and read over the stuff on that topic, or go back to one of the sections of this video and listen to that area that you struggled with. Well done if you were confident and you got lots of these right. Final thing that I would do is spend some of your own time making a revision material. Studies have shown that it's really important that you go back to topics multiple times, and each time you do, you'll remember a little bit more. You've already highlighted your revision pack and made some good notes, but it would definitely be worth making some kind of revision clock or spider diagram on this topic of opposition, economy and World War II. If you do choose to use a revision clock, you can see there are 12 headings that you can use to organise your notes. And remember that when you're making those notes, you could use what's on this PowerPoint and in that revision booklet, but you could also go back and use your class notes or even the Nazi Germany revision videos in the Year 10 Carlton Academy playlist on YouTube as well, if you wanted to. There are lots of different resources for you to use, and you don't have to do this, but it would be a very wise idea to now make a material at some point this week using these headings. Okay, well done for getting to the end of the video.